So are you ready to step into the wild? Oh yeah, kind of. I know, like I'm getting the sense that the enthusiasm of stepping into the wild is waning over these weeks because we're in this series leading up to Easter. We're in week 3 of 6. I had to do my math really quick. And last week we talked about wilderness as being someplace where we could spend our entire lives. So I was expecting today when I said, "Are you willing to step in the wild?" People would be like, not if I have to stay there forever. Week 1 was good when it was only 40 days, but last week we talked about the wilderness as being a place where we might be stuck for a while, experiencing chronic illness or mental health conditions, or maybe even systemic oppression. It's a place where there is a sense of loss and isolation and loneliness. But here's the good news. Today we're going to talk about the wilderness as being a place of holy encounter, a place where we can encounter the presence of God. But the challenge is that we can get so lost in the craziness and busyness of life that we just might miss that holy encounter. So before I get too much into it and dive right into preaching, I want to introduce myself. I'm Carter. I'm the lead pastor here at The Walk. And on behalf of this wonderful, loving community, we are so glad that you have joined us for worship today. Whether it's your first time here or you've been here thousands of times before, whether you are grieving a loss that happened last night in light blue or you're celebrating a dark blue victory this morning. I don't know, Duke. Oh, man. And Carolina, or you're just needing a break from whatever wilderness you're experiencing out in the world, you're welcome here. You're a child of God, just as we celebrated with Lachlan, and we believe that it's God's grace that stirs in us and in you that can transform not just our lives, but the world. So we invite you to be a part of that. Let us pray. God of grace and God of glory, God who knows each one of us, fill this space this morning with your presence. Fill us with your grace. Because some of us, we've gathered seeking rest from the wilderness of the world, whether that is depression or isolation or the wilderness of exhaustion or being overworked, or the wilderness of having to wear a mask and hide who we truly are, the wilderness of questioning whether or not we are enough, the wilderness of fear and anxiety and uncertainty about what tomorrow may bring, the wilderness of wondering about the safety of our children, our schools, and our communities. And yet, amid all of this, oh God, you are present. Help us to open our eyes and hearts and ears to encounter those holy moments this morning, to be able to discern your presence in our midst. And may the words that I speak and all that we experience be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I've got a confession for you today. I'm a to-do list person. No, is that surprising? A little bit. Like, I am a to-do list person so much so that, like, I have lists of things that I need to do for the walk, things that I need to do in my own life. And I was telling Rodney before worship today that I, like, keep my to-do list in something that's really pretty on the outside, because when it gets in the inside, it's pretty crazy. And, like, this is like my to-do list for the week. And there's different categories of where the lists fall. Like over here is like the time structure. And then right here is the amount of stuff that's got to squeeze in the in-between times in the day. And then over here is stuff, if I can get to it, I will. You know, like that stuff. Don't feel guilty if you don't check it off, but ideally you would check it off. And then over here is the things that don't fit here because I have to reorganize it, and it goes on and on. I'm letting you into my little bit of crazy, aren't I? But last fall, I got the opportunity to participate in a continuing ed program and a training on different personality types, and they said that everybody has one of 6 is your baseline personality types, and And I took the test and was a little bit skeptical, but when they said I was a thinker and my natural state is a thinker who values order and time structure, and I said, so you mean like this? And I showed my calendar, and they took a picture of it to use it as an example of a classic thinker. But I want to read to you a sample list, and unfortunately I can't read my handwriting, so I'm going to pull it up from here. This was from this weekend. Take out the trash and the recycling, do the dishes and the laundry, then replace the trash bag in the trash can, clean the car, eat the leftovers, walk the dog, feed the dog, take vitamins, floss, drink water, feed the cats, read, nap. You know you've got a thing going on when you put nap on the list to check off. Journal, read, and pray. This is how I cope to navigate the world. And if you are a base thinker, as they would say, you might have some of these tendencies too. But everyone has a way that they cope with the chaos of life and to navigate it. I put all of it there so I can just tuck it away and deal with it when the time comes, but I know it's there waiting for me when I'm ready. Others of us have a make it happen attitude. And if you're given a task, you're going to not stop until you get it done. Others of us respond to the chaos and busyness of the world through spontaneity and creativity. Those are often called rebels. Others are all about building community and in touch with feelings and compassions, and that drives what they do in a moment. Other people are driven by their values and convictions and beliefs. And then there's others that are super reflective and are driven by the invitation for space to pause and reflect on all the chaos that is happening. Whichever way you find yourself navigating the busyness and the chaos of life, I invite you to find that space this morning, because we're going to put ourselves in the position of the disciples, and we're going to put ourselves in the position of the disciples in the gospel according to Mark. And in Mark, things get crazy, and they get crazy fast. I would clearly be the disciple that's trying to organize Jesus and have everything down in a task list so we can get it done. But there's going to be other disciples and other personality types that are surrounding Jesus as well. But I want you to get into that place that you use to cope, that healthy place that you use to cope, because we're going to go on this adventure with them. But I want to tell you a little bit about what has happened before we actually dive in. So we're going to be in the middle of the first chapter of Mark. So you're probably thinking, nothing's really happened, right? He's been born. No, wrong. Because Mark cuts out all details, like very few details, very few speaking lines, very few transitions. He just moves immediately from one thing to the other. So here's what's happened so far. John has gone before Jesus, preparing the way. Jesus showed up. John baptized him in the river Jordan. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness facing temptation and wild beasts, and he returned, started preaching. John got arrested. And then Jesus finds himself again in a synagogue, proclaiming the good news, healing and casting out demons, and preaching the good news of all that is to come. And we're just going to be in verse 29. That's all that's happened so far. So I want you to just put yourself in that place where you're ready to embrace the chaos of life and ministry that is before us. Are you there? Are you ready? All right, let's hear what happens next. Beginning in verse 29. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus, James, and John went home with Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed sick with a fever. They told Jesus about her at once. He went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. The fever left her, and she served them. That evening at sunset, people brought to Jesus those who were sick or demon-possessed. The whole town gathered near the door. He healed many who were sick with all kinds of diseases, and he threw out many demons, but he didn't let the demons speak because they recognized him. Then early in the morning, well before sunrise, Jesus rose and went to a deserted place where he could be alone in prayer. Simon and those with him tracked him down. And when they found him, they told him, "Everybody's looking for you." I imagine that their cries and their pleas went on to like, "We've got stuff to do. We've got good stuff to do. Remember that to-do list? Remember your values and convictions? Remember your need to include everybody? Come on. Get up. Let's go." But Jesus replied, "Let's head in the other direction, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there too. That's why I've come." And so he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and throwing out demons. It's clear, even without too many details in the gospel according to Mark, that Jesus is in the ministry and the business of casting out demons and healing people. Jesus is in the ministry of meeting people in whatever wilderness they're experiencing and leading people to life and to wholeness, to the kingdom of God. So he's showing up in places with people, in the wilderness of sickness, in the wilderness of mental health struggles, in the wilderness of isolation, in the wilderness of poverty and hunger and exclusion and oppression, in the wilderness of being imprisoned. And he meets people in that place and promises them that there is life to come, that death, that isolation, that sickness, that oppression is not the end of the story, but that his good news invites people into something more, a life of healing, a life of wholeness, community, fullness, inclusion, grace, salvation, mercy, and redemption. All of what Jesus is doing in this first part is good. If I'm a disciple and I'm going down that to-do list, I'm like, healing, good. Teaching, good. Casting out demons, good. Come on, you got a lot before you, Jesus. I'm not sure if I would have put sneaking out in the middle of the night on that list. But Jesus pauses in the middle of his busyness, in the middle of meeting people in their wildernesses, to go to his own wilderness, to go to a deserted place of his own and have a different kind of holy encounter. One of my favorite parts about spending time with this passage this week was learning how the disciples found Jesus. So I am a vegetarian, for those of you who do not know, so I've spent very limited time hunting. However, I have enough hunters in my family to know that it is a sport and an art and takes great skill. Well, the verb that is used here to talk about how the disciples found Jesus is one that you would use in hunting, like stalked, tracked down. We're on a mission to find him. We're not going to stop until they found that Jesus. Not meat or wild animal, but it's the same verb and action that you would use for that. Because I can imagine the chaos and the feelings of being distraught and frustrated that the disciples felt when suddenly Jesus was doing something off of the to-do list. That's me. Or they thought Jesus was going to make it happen and heal the whole town, but suddenly he was nowhere to be found. Or that Jesus seemed to be all about the people, but was suddenly not, and was backing out on his values and retreating to be alone. I can imagine that there was a sense of anxiety that filled them. Like, where in the world has he gone? But there's something really important that happens in this moment. It happens actually 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus goes alone to pray at the beginning of his ministry, in the middle of his ministry, and then at the end of his ministry. And it's something that happens here, where he pauses in the midst of the busyness to be reminded of who he is and whose he is. That he is the Son of God, and that it is not by his own power or being alone that he is able to do this ministry, but it is God's presence in him and through him that he casts out demons, that he heals the sick, that he brings people to salvation, and he walks in the world in this way. And you know what it does? It turns their ministry on a dime. he doesn't go back to the same place. He goes in the opposite direction to provide healing and preaching and teaching to a new group of people. It throws out the to-do list. It turns the disciples and their busyness on their tails, and they're forced to recalibrate and to reorientate themselves around this ministry. So our challenge in this passage is to try and create space for these holy encounters in our lives. Now, I'm not a parent, but I can imagine, or I've heard, what it's like to be a new parent in the sense that your schedule changes. Is that true? Yeah? Imagine what that's going to look like when I have a child, my to-do list. But I imagine that, you feel a little bit like you're in the wilderness because this thing you love and have created and are now responsible of is separate from you, and you've got this deep sense of vulnerability and love to care for it and protect it, to nurture it, to grow it. I also can imagine that you feel a little bit in the wilderness because of the busyness that happens. Like now there's diaper changes and bottles to monitor and keep a schedule of. There are dishes that have to be washed far more than ever before, and laundry, I hear, it really goes out the roof. I imagine that to-do list really picks up too. And it can be tempting in this wilderness, this new wilderness, to be focused on all of this stuff that is good, the caring and the nurturing. But the challenge for parents and for all of us, really, is to be able to pause and experience our own holy encounters in the presence of God so that we can remember who we are and whose we are in order to meet people in the wildernesses of their own lives. So the wilderness is not always something to turn and run from, but a space to be embraced, a space where we can be transformed, a space where we can be renewed by the grace of God. It's as Jan Richardson says, in every desert, and this is her prayer, in every desert let clarity come, let discernment drench you, let the angels attend to you. I imagine that's what Jesus was doing in that moment before his disciples interrupted him, that he was allowing clarity about his mission and vision and call to come, that he was letting discernment drench him, and let the angels in the presence of God attend to him. And it turned him in a different direction. So as we've committed to Laughlin today, and we've committed to each other to support one another in faith, we've also got to support and challenge one another to pause, to open our hearts to these holy encounters where we can be transformed by God's presence, to set aside the to-do list and the busyness, even if it means you got to include time to be set aside on the list, because someone in here's got to have it on there in order to make it happen. To encounter the presence of God and be transformed by God's grace, because that, our own encounters with God and the ways that allows us to live and reflect the gospel to others, is how we're going to be able to nurture folks like Laughlin into lives of faith. It is God's grace at work in us and through us that then turns lives of the people around us. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.